The Atlantic never forgives human arrogance. Waves crash against the bow of a small fishing boat, fighting through a darkening sea. 20 miles away, champagne glasses clink aboard a towering cruise ship, its lights blazing against the gathering storm. Two worlds separated by water and wealth, on a collision course with destiny. They say the ocean remembers every promise broken, every corner cut, every safety inspection falsified by men in boardrooms who never felt the sting of salt spray on their faces. When the storm hits, it won't care about stock prices or quarterly reports. It won't distinguish between the fisherman who reads the water, like ancient scripture, and the executives who traded lives for profit margins. The sea demands respect, and when denied, it collects its due with terrible precision. Some men run from disaster, others sail straight into its heart, risking everything for strangers when the waters rise and steel begins to fail. This is what happens when catastrophe strips away pretense, leaving only the raw truth of who we are beneath the surface. The North Atlantic had a way of reminding Jack Reynolds that no man, regardless of his experience, was ever truly its master. 58 years on this earth, nearly 40 of them on the water, and still the old sea could surprise him with its sudden fury. "She's brewing something nasty," Jack muttered, scanning the eastern horizon where dark clouds gathered like bruises against the dawn sky. His weathered fingers gripped the worn wheel of the Redemption, a 42-foot fishing trawler that had seen better days much like her captain. The salt-laden wind whipped across his face, stinging the scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. A souvenir from Desert Storm, when an Iraqi patrol boat had opened fire on his naval vessel. The memory still visited him in dreams, the flames and screams as vivid now as they were in '91. The radio crackled to life. Harbor Point weather advisory. Gale warning issued for coastal waters. Wind speeds expected to reach 45 knots by midday. All vessels advised to seek safe harbor immediately. Jack glanced at his fuel gauge in the empty fish hold. 8 hours out, and barely enough catch to cover the gas. The bank wouldn't care about weather advisories when the loan payment came due next week. "Just need a few more hours," he said to no one in particular, his voice lost in the engine's steady rumble. The Redemption pushed forward, cutting through increasingly agitated swells. Back in Harbor Point, 16-year-old Lily Reynolds frowned at the test tubes arranged on her makeshift lab table. Actually, the kitchen counter of their small harborside apartment. Each contained water samples from different locations in the bay, collected over the past month. Lily tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and adjusted her glasses. At 16, she had her mother's analytical mind and her father's stubborn determination. Where most teenagers dreamed of escaping their small coastal town, Lily dreamed of MIT and oceanography studies. Her application was due in 3 months, and this independent research project could be her ticket in if the results were as significant as she suspected. "Nitrogen levels are definitely increasing," she murmured, making careful notes in her journal. "And these trace elements." Her brow furrowed as she compared readings. The wheezing sound started subtly, almost imperceptible at first. Then her lungs tightened. Lily reached for the inhaler on the counter, taking a deep breath of the medicine that kept her asthma in check. The prescription needed refilling, another expense they could barely afford. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the gray waters of Harbor Point Bay. Somewhere out there, her father was fighting the sea and weather to keep them afloat financially. The thought made her chest tighten in a way no medication could help. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" Elizabeth Caldwell stood on the upper observation deck of the Oceanic Majesty, a towering testament to luxury that dwarfed the modest fishing vessels of Harbor Point. At 62, Elizabeth carried herself with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to power. Her tailored navy suit and pearl necklace were as much a uniform as any admiral's. "It's certainly large," replied Captain Thomas Wright, a 30-year veteran of maritime command who'd been recruited from retirement for this prestigious position. Elizabeth's lips curved in a thin smile. "The largest passenger vessel on the eastern seaboard, Captain, 22 decks, accommodations for 4,500 passengers, 1,800 crew, a floating city that will revolutionize the cruise industry. And your father would have been proud, Wright offered, knowing the history of Atlantis Cruise Corporation and its founder, Harold Caldwell, a legend in the shipping world since the 1960s. The smile faded from Elizabeth's face. My father would have inspected every weld, every rivet before allowing passengers aboard. She turned to face the captain directly, which is precisely what I intend to do before tomorrow's maiden voyage. I understand there have been some concerns raised by the engineering staff. Wright shifted uncomfortably. Just minor issues. Ms. Caldwell, nothing that would compromise safety. I'll be the judge of that, Elizabeth replied, her tone brooking no argument. Richard may be CEO, but this vessel still bears my family name, regardless of what the stockholders think. As if summoned by his mention, Richard Harmon's voice called from behind them. Elizabeth, there you are. Elizabeth stiffened almost imperceptibly before turning. At 65, Richard Harmon embodied the excess of the 1980s that had never quite left his system, from his designer suit to his perfectly coiffed silver hair. His smile revealed teeth too white to be natural, a perfect metaphor for the man himself. The governor just arrived for the pre-launch reception, Richard announced. We need you downstairs for photos. I was just discussing the engineering reports with Captain Wright, Elizabeth replied. There seemed to be some outstanding issues. All minor, Richard interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. The ship passed inspection with flying colors. We can't afford any delays, not with the publicity machine already in full swing. Elizabeth's blue eyes hardened. Safety is not a publicity concern. Richard, of course not, he agreed smoothly, taking her elbow to guide her toward the elevators. But neither is it served by last-minute paranoia. The Majesty is the most technologically advanced vessel in our fleet. Nothing has been overlooked. As they walked away, Elizabeth glanced back at Captain Wright, who averted his eyes. The gesture told her everything she needed to know. Qui camito. The first trawl had yielded a pathetic catch, mostly bycatch and fish too small to meet regulations. Jack reset the nets with practiced efficiency, ignoring the growing ache in his shoulders. Age was catching up to him, but acknowledging it wouldn't pay the bills. A distant horn caught his attention. Squinting against the strengthening winds, he spotted the massive silhouette of a cruise ship approaching Harbor Point. Even from this distance, the Oceanic Majesty was an impressive sight, its white hull gleaming against the darkening sky. Floating city for rich folks, Jack muttered. Won't even spend their money in town. The radio crackled again. Redemption, this is Coast Guard Patrol Boat Eagle. Do you copy? Jack grabbed the handset. Eagle, this is Redemption. Go ahead. Jack, it's Miller. You seeing this weather report, storms intensifying faster than predicted. You might want to head in. Jack glanced at his empty fish hold. Appreciate the concern, Miller, but I need a few more hours. A pause, then, your call. Captain, just don't cut it too close. This one's got the meteorologist worried. Roger that. Redemption out. Jack replaced the handset and rubbed his face wearily. The mortgage payment was due next week. Lily's MIT application fees would come due the week after, not to mention her medication. The math was simple and brutal. No catch meant no money. As he adjusted course to a promising location marked on his weathered charts, his thoughts drifted to Diana. 8 years gone. But sometimes the ache felt as fresh as the day the doctor had pronounced the cancer terminal. She'd have known what to do about Lily's college dreams, about the mounting bills. Diana had always been the planner, the one who saw paths forward when all Jack could see were obstacles. I'm trying. Die, he whispered to the wind. God knows I'm trying. The Harborside Tavern had seen better days, much like the fishing industry it served. Once the heart of Harbor Point's social scene, the Rusty Anchor now catered to a dwindling crowd of fishermen, most of whom had weathered too many storms to count both at sea and in life. Frank Moore nursed a beer at the corner table, his eyes constantly darting to the entrance. At 55, Frank's once powerful frame had softened, but he still carried himself with the discipline of his 20 years in the Navy. He and Jack had served together during Desert Storm, a brotherhood forged in fire and seawater. When Jack finally pushed through the door, Frank waved him over with visible relief. "Beginning to think you weren't coming," Frank said as Jack slid into the seat opposite him. "Almost didn't," Jack replied, signaling the bartender for a coffee. "Weather's turning nasty out there." Frank leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's actually why I needed to see you. It's about the Oceanic Majesty." Jack's expression hardened. "What about it?" "I've been working safety consultation for Atlantis Corp for the past 6 months," Frank explained. "Routine inspections, certification, the usual bureaucracy." "Didn't know you'd gone corporate," Jack said, a hint of judgment in his tone. Frank ignored the barb. "2 weeks ago, I found serious issues with the emergency evacuation systems. Lifeboats that wouldn't deploy properly during testing. Fire suppression systems that were installed but never actually connected." He took a long pull from his beer. "I filed the reports, recommended delaying the launch until everything was addressed." "Let me guess," Jack said as his coffee arrived. "They ignored you." "Worse." Frank pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "They offered me this to amend my reports." Jack opened the envelope, his eyes widening at the check inside. $50,000. "Blood money," Frank said bitterly. "The vessel isn't seaworthy, Jack. Not for a full passenger complement, but they're launching tomorrow anyway." Jack studied his old friend's face. "Why are you telling me this? Why not go to the Coast Guard? The maritime authorities?" "I tried. Got stonewalled. Atlantis has friends in high places. Besides," Frank's voice dropped even lower, "these people aren't the type to take rejection well. I've got a family to think about." "So do I," Jack replied, sliding the envelope back. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" "I don't know," Frank admitted. "Maybe nothing, but that ship is carrying 3,000 passengers and crew on its maiden voyage, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened and I'd said nothing." He finished his beer in one swallow. "Just thought you should know, given your history with the Caldwell family." Jack's face darkened. "That was a lifetime ago." "Maybe, but Elizabeth Caldwell is aboard that ship right now, and if anyone could stop this launch, it's her." Frank stood, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Just think about it." As Frank left, Jack stared into his coffee, the past swirling up like sediment from the harbor floor. Some histories were better left undisturbed. Lily's breath caught when she saw the recruitment flyer tacked to the Harbor Point High School bulletin board. Oceanic Majesty Academic Scholarship for promising students in marine sciences. Full 4-year college tuition interviews conducted aboard ship during maiden voyage, May 15, 1995. "You should apply," said Ms. Winters, her science teacher, appearing beside her. "Your water quality research is exactly the kind of initiative they're looking for." Lily traced the embossed lettering on the flyer. "It seems too good to be true." "Atlantis Corporation has been funding marine education for years," Ms. Winters explained. "Elizabeth Caldwell sits on the board of several prestigious oceanographic institutions." "My dad wouldn't approve," Lily said hesitantly. "He has issues with big corporations." Ms. Winters smiled gently. "Sometimes we need to separate personal feelings from professional opportunities. Think about it. At least the deadline's tomorrow." After she left, Lily carefully removed the flyer, folding it into her notebook. A full scholarship would solve everything. MIT wouldn't just be a dream anymore. All she needed was to get on that ship tomorrow and impress the right people. Now she just had to convince her father. The engineering deck of the Oceanic Majesty hummed with activity as final preparations for tomorrow's launch continued around the clock. Elizabeth Caldwell, clipboard in hand, followed Chief Engineer Ramirez through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship's mechanical heart. As you can see, Ms. Caldwell, everything is functioning within operational parameters, Ramirez explained, gesturing to the massive turbines. We've run full diagnostics on all primary systems. And the issues noted in Mr. Moore's report, Elizabeth asked, flipping through pages of technical specifications. Ramirez hesitated. Those were addressed. Addressed how? Elizabeth pressed. Because according to this, the port side evacuation systems failed 3 consecutive deployment tests last week. Before Ramirez could answer, Richard Harmon's voice cut through the mechanical background noise. There you are, Elizabeth, the governor is asking for you. Elizabeth turned, irritation evident in her posture. I'm in the middle of an inspection. Richard, an unnecessary inspection, he replied smoothly, steering her away from the chief engineer. Everything has been certified by the maritime authorities. We launch tomorrow, as scheduled. Once they were alone in the service elevator, Elizabeth confronted him directly. Frank Moore's safety reports. Moore was looking for a bigger paycheck. Richard interrupted. We've replaced him with more cooperative consultants. You bribed him, Elizabeth's voice rose in disbelief. I offered compensation for his discretion regarding preliminary findings that have since been addressed. Richard corrected. This is business. Elizabeth, your father understood that sometimes corners need to be rounded, not cut, just rounded to meet deadlines. Don't you dare invoke my father, Elizabeth said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Harold Caldwell never compromised on safety, not once in 40 years. The elevator doors opened onto the opulent main deck, where waitstaff bustled about preparing for the evening's pre-launch gala. Richard's smile returned instantly, the corporate mask sliding seamlessly back into place. Just play your part tonight, he said quietly. Smile for the cameras, charm the investors, leave the operational decisions to those of us who understand modern business realities. As he walked away, Elizabeth stood motionless, the clipboard clutched against her chest. Atlantis Cruise Corporation had been her family's legacy, built from a single passenger ferry in the 1950s to an empire that dominated the eastern seaboard. But since her father's death and the company's public offering 3 years ago, that legacy had been eroding, sacrificed on the altar of quarterly profits and shareholder value. Her father would have shut down the launch immediately, but her father had owned controlling interest. Now Elizabeth was just another executive, albeit one with a famous name. She needed more information before she could act, and she knew exactly where to start looking. Jack returned to the apartment after dark, his body aching from fighting the increasingly rough seas. The meager catch he'd managed to bring in had barely covered the fuel costs. Another day of falling behind. He found Lily at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around her, the soft strains of Pearl Jam playing from the cassette player Diana had given her for her 13th birthday. You should be in bed, he said, hanging his weathered jacket by the door. I was waiting for you. Lily's voice held a careful neutrality that immediately put Jack on alert. She pushed a piece of paper across the table. I need you to sign this. Jack picked up the form, scanning it with growing disapproval. A day trip on the Oceanic Majesty? Absolutely not. Dad, it's for a scholarship interview, Lily explained. Full college tuition. Miss Winters recommended me. You're not getting on that floating monstrosity, Jack said firmly, dropping the form back on the table. Those corporate cruise ships are nothing but trouble. This is my chance. Lily rarely raised her voice, but frustration overrode her usual restraint. Do you know what MIT costs more than we'll make in 5 years? This scholarship is the only way I'll ever get there. Jack ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, the weight of inadequacy settling heavily on his shoulders. Lily, listen. No, you listen, she interrupted, rising from her chair. Mom would have wanted this for me. She would have signed in a heartbeat. The mention of Diana hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. Jack turned away, moving to the refrigerator to hide the emotion that flashed across his face. The weather forecast is bad, he said finally. Storms coming in fast. The ship has stabilizers, Lily countered. It'll be a 3-hour trip up the coast and back. Please, Dad, this is important. Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She had Diana's determination, that same stubborn tilt to her chin when she believed in something. Fighting her on this would only drive another wedge between them, and God knew there were enough of those already. I'll think about it, he conceded. That's not a yes. Lily's face brightened slightly. The interviews start at 10. We need to be at the dock by 9. I said I'll think about it, Jack repeated, but they both knew he was wavering. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Jack sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee long gone cold. Frank's warnings echoed in his mind, mingling with the desperate hope he'd seen in his daughter's eyes. The scholarship would change everything for Lily, but if Frank was right about the safety issues. Jack reached for the phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. Miller, it's Jack Reynolds. I need a favor. What do you know about the safety certifications for the Oceanic Majesty? Shironime, Wanamon. The Harbor Point docks bustled with unusual activity as dawn broke on the day of the Oceanic Majesty's maiden voyage. News crews set up cameras to capture the historic departure. Local vendors hawked commemorative T-shirts and souvenirs, and a steady stream of passengers moved toward the massive vessel that dominated the harbor. Jack and Lily approached the security checkpoint, both dressed in their Sunday best, which for Jack meant a slightly faded blue button-down and the only tie he owned. He kept one hand protectively on Lily's shoulder, scanning the crowds with the habitual wariness of a man who'd seen what crowds could become when things went wrong. Dad, stop looking like we're walking into an ambush, Lily whispered. This is supposed to be exciting. Jack forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just stay close. After checking their documentation, a uniformed attendant directed them toward the VIP boarding area, a courtesy extended to scholarship candidates. As they made their way through the throng, Jack spotted a familiar face near the main gangway. Wait here a second, he told Lily, pointing to a bench. I need to check something. Before she could protest, Jack was moving through the crowd toward Frank Moore, who was engaged in animated conversation with a ship's officer. As Jack approached, Frank looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. Jack, what are you doing here? Could ask you the same, Jack replied. Thought you were off the project. Frank glanced nervously at the officer, who excused himself. I've been reinstated as a safety consultant. Last-minute decision from upstairs. Meaning you took the money, Jack said, disappointment evident in his tone. It's not that simple, Frank replied, lowering his voice. They're addressing the issues I raised. I'm here to verify the fixes before departure. And are they fixed? Frank hesitated. Some of them. Enough to make the voyage safely, with certain operational adjustments. Jack leaned closer. I need the truth. Frank, my daughter's on board for this cruise. Scholarship interview. Understanding dawned on Frank's face. Lily, she's applying for the Caldwell Marine Science Grant. Jack nodded tersely. Frank sighed, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Look, the ship isn't perfect. There are compromises I'm not happy about. But for a day cruise in good weather, the risk is minimal. And in bad weather, Jack pressed. Frank's silence was answer enough. The forecast, Jack began, has been updated. Frank interrupted. The storms changed direction, heading farther east. We'll barely feel it. You sure about that? No, Frank admitted. But I'll be on board monitoring everything. If I see anything concerning, I'll raise hell money be damned. Jack studied his old friend's face, trying to discern truth from rationalization. I trusted you in the Gulf. Frank, people died when intelligence was wrong. This isn't combat. Jack, it's a cruise ship. People can die just as easily, Jack replied. Often more. Before Frank could respond, a commotion near the main gangway drew their attention. A group of environmental protesters had unfurled banners condemning cruise ship pollution. Atlantis poisons our waters. Read one sign, "Stop corporate destruction of marine life." Proclaimed another. Security personnel moved quickly to contain the demonstration, but not before news cameras captured the confrontation. Jack watched as a tall, elegant woman in a blue suit emerged from the ship to speak with the security team. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about her bearing. "That's Elizabeth Caldwell," Frank said, following Jack's gaze. "Executive VP and daughter of the founder. She's the one who reinstated me this morning." Jack's expression changed subtly. "Elizabeth Caldwell is on board. Yeah, for the maiden voyage." "Why you know her?" "No," Jack said, too quickly. "Just curious." Frank gave him an odd look but didn't press the issue. "Listen, I need to get back to my inspection rounds. If you're really concerned, keep Lily off the ship. But I promise I won't let anything happen if I can help it." As Frank walked away, Jack remained rooted in place, watching Elizabeth Caldwell handle the situation with practiced diplomacy. After a few minutes of conversation, the protesters were peacefully escorted away from the boarding area. Their point made, but the launch proceedings undisturbed. Jack hadn't seen Elizabeth Caldwell in person for nearly 25 years, not since his naval unit had been assigned to protect her father's shipping fleet during the tensions with Libya in the early 1970s. She wouldn't remember him. He'd been just another young officer then, but he remembered her, the serious young woman who had argued passionately with her father about maritime regulations and environmental protections. Even then, if Elizabeth Caldwell was personally overseeing this voyage, perhaps Frank was right. Perhaps the safety concerns were being addressed. Jack returned to Lily, who was practically vibrating with impatience. "Can we board now? The orientation for scholarship candidates starts in 20 minutes." Jack took a deep breath, weighing everything he'd learned against the hope in his daughter's eyes. "All right, but you stay where I can find you. Understand? And if I say we leave no arguments." Lily's face lit up. "Thank you, Dad." She threw her arms around him in a rare public display of affection that momentarily dissolved the knot of anxiety in Jack's chest. As they joined the boarding queue, Jack cast one last glance at the eastern horizon. The sky was clear for now, but experience had taught him how quickly that could change. The oceanic majesty was even more impressive from within. Soaring atriums, cascading crystal chandeliers, marble floors that reflected the oceanic-themed artworks adorning the walls, all designed to evoke the golden age of sea travel while showcasing modern luxury. Lily gaped at the opulence as they were escorted to the Neptune Lounge, where the scholarship candidates and their guardians were gathering. "This is like a floating palace," she whispered. Jack nodded distractedly, his attention focused on the structural elements hidden beneath the decorative surfaces. Years of maritime experience had trained him to look past aesthetics to the bones of a vessel. The Neptune Lounge was already filled with 24 teenagers and their parents, all dressed in their finest and wearing expressions ranging from nervous excitement to calculated confidence. A young woman in an Atlantis Corporation uniform was distributing information packets. "Welcome to the Oceanic Majesty Scholarship Program," she announced once everyone was seated. "My name is Sarah Caldwell, and I'll be coordinating your interviews today." Jack's attention snapped to the young woman. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with Elizabeth's poised demeanor but softer features. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "Each candidate will have a 30-minute interview with our selection committee," Sarah continued. "Parents are welcome to enjoy the ship's amenities during this time. We've arranged a special tour of the bridge for those interested." As Sarah began calling names for the first round of interviews, Jack leaned toward Lily. "You prepared?" Lily nodded, clutching her research portfolio. "I've been practicing all week." "Reynolds." "Lily," Sarah called. Lily stood, smoothing her skirt nervously. "That's me." "Perfect timing," Sarah smiled. "You're up first." Jack squeezed Lily's hand. "You'll knock 'em dead, kiddo." As Lily followed Sarah out of the lounge, Jack found himself suddenly at loose ends. The bridge tour wouldn't start for another hour, and sitting alone with anxious parents held little appeal. He decided to explore the ship, partly out of curiosity and partly to assess Frank's safety concerns firsthand. The Oceanic Majesty had begun moving, slipping away from the Harbor Point dock with surprising grace for such a massive vessel. Passengers lined the railings, waving to the crowds gathered along the shore. Jack made his way through public areas, noting emergency exit routes and lifeboating stations with a professional eye. On Deck 7, he paused at a large display showcasing the history of Atlantis Cruise Corporation. Photos chronicled the company's evolution from a small regional ferry service to an international cruise line. Harold Caldwell featured prominently a stern-faced man with piercing eyes who'd built an empire from nothing. "He never smiled for photographs," a voice said from behind him. "Said it undermined his authority?" Jack turned to find Elizabeth Caldwell standing there, elegant in her blue suit despite the early hour. Up close, the years were more evident, fine lines around her eyes, silver threading through her blonde hair, but she carried them with dignity. "You knew him?" Jack asked, playing ignorant. "He was my father," Elizabeth replied, extending her hand. "Elizabeth Caldwell." "Jack Reynolds," he said, taking her hand briefly. "My daughter's interviewing for your scholarship program." "How wonderful." "Sarah, my daughter, coordinates the program. She's passionate about supporting young scientists." "Runs in the family, apparently," Jack commented, gesturing to the display where a younger Elizabeth was pictured receiving an Environmental Conservation Award. She smiled slightly. "You've done your homework, Mr. Reynolds." "Just Jack," he corrected, "and no homework needed. Your family's practically maritime royalty on the eastern seaboard." Elizabeth's expression clouded slightly. "Royalty comes with responsibility, something the current management sometimes forgets." Before Jack could respond, Richard Harmon approached, his politician's smile firmly in place. "Elizabeth, the governor is asking about you." He turned to Jack, assessing him with a quick glance. "Richard Harmon, CEO of Atlantis Corporation." "Jack Reynolds," Jack replied, noting how Elizabeth's posture had stiffened at Harmon's arrival. "Mr. Reynolds is a scholarship parent," Elizabeth explained. "Excellent." Harmon's enthusiasm seemed rehearsed. "Always good to invest in young minds. If you'll excuse us, we have some corporate matters to discuss." As Harmon led Elizabeth away, she glanced back at Jack with an unreadable expression. The interaction left Jack with an unsettled feeling. There was obvious tension between the two executives, and Elizabeth's comment about responsibility hadn't seemed like casual conversation. Jack continued his exploration, finding his way to the upper deck where passengers were enjoying the panoramic ocean views. The Oceanic Majesty had left the protected waters of Harbor Point Bay and was now in open sea, moving parallel to the coastline. The motion was barely perceptible, a testament to the ship's advanced stabilization systems. In the distance, however, dark clouds were gathering on the eastern horizon, exactly where the storm had been predicted before its supposed change of course. Jack frowned, pulling out the small weather radio he habitually carried. The forecast update confirmed his suspicions. The storm had reversed direction again and was strengthening. While not yet a hurricane, it was developing into a significant nor'easter that would bring gale-force winds and heavy seas directly into their path. Jack pocketed the radio, a familiar tension settling into his shoulders. He needed to find Frank Moore and confirm whether the ship was prepared for the worsening conditions, and he needed to locate Lily. Scholarship or not, if the weather deteriorated, he wanted them both back on solid ground. The scholarship interview was being conducted in a luxurious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. Lily sat across from three judges: a distinguished marine biologist, a university admissions director, and Sarah Caldwell. "Your research on industrial pollutants in Harbor Point Bay is quite impressive," the biologist commented, reviewing Lily's portfolio, "especially the correlation between cruise ship activity and increased chemical markers in the sediment." Lily nodded, trying to control her nervous excitement. "I've been collecting samples for 6 months. The data shows a clear pattern of contamination that coincides with increased maritime traffic, particularly from larger vessels. The admissions director raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting that cruise ships like the Oceanic Majesty are contributing to water pollution? Lily hesitated, suddenly aware of the potentially awkward implication. All large vessels impact their environment. My research isn't about assigning blame, but understanding the mechanisms so we can develop better solutions. Sarah Caldwell smiled approvingly. Well said. Addressing environmental challenges requires understanding before action. She made a note on her tablet. What prompted your interest in marine ecology? My mother, Lily replied, her voice softening. She was a biology teacher. Before she died, we used to collect specimens along the shore. She taught me that the ocean connects everything that what we do to it, we ultimately do to ourselves. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, covering Lily's academic achievements and future goals. When it concluded, Sarah walked her out personally. That was impressive, Sarah said as they navigated the corridor. Your research is exactly the kind of initiative we want to encourage. Thank you, Lily replied, still buzzing from the adrenaline of the interview. When will you make decisions on the scholarships? The committee will deliberate over lunch and will announce the recipients at the afternoon reception. Sarah paused, her expression becoming more personal. Between us, I think you should feel very optimistic. Lily's heart soared. This could actually happen. MIT could actually happen. Now, Sarah continued, there's a special presentation for candidates in the Poseidon Theater in 30 minutes. In the meantime, would you like to see our marine research lab? It's not usually open to passengers. Are you kidding? I'd love to. As they headed toward the research facilities, Lily noticed the ship's motion becoming more pronounced. Outside the windows, the sky had darkened considerably, and whitecaps dotted the previously calm sea. Is that normal? She asked, pointing to the deteriorating conditions. Sarah's professional smile faltered slightly. We're expecting some weather, but nothing the Majesty can't handle. These ships are designed to operate in all conditions. The confidence in Sarah's voice was reassuring, but as they continued deeper into the ship, Lily couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Jack found Frank Moore in the crew area of Deck 3 engaged in a heated discussion with Chief Engineer Ramirez. Both men fell silent as Jack approached. Mr. Reynolds, Ramirez acknowledged stiffly. This is a restricted area. I'm with him, Jack said, gesturing to Frank. We serve together. Need to talk to him for a minute. Ramirez glanced between them, clearly unhappy but unwilling to challenge the connection. 5 minutes. Then you need to return to passenger areas. He walked away, casting a warning look at Frank. You shouldn't be here, Jack, Frank said once they were alone. Weather report changed again, Jack replied without preamble. Storms heading straight for us, intensifying. Category 1, maybe Category 2 within hours. Frank's expression tightened. I know. We just got the update from Maritime Weather Service. Is the ship turning back? That's being discussed. Frank's hesitation spoke volumes. Harmon wants to continue the voyage, says the schedule is too important to change. And the Captain Wright is recommending we return to Harbor Point, but he's getting pushback from the executive level. Jack ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This is exactly what you were worried about. Safety compromises. It's not that simple, Frank began, but Jack cut him off. It is that simple. You don't sail into a storm unless you have no choice. We have a choice. Frank lowered his voice. Look, between us, the ship has issues. The stabilization system is running at 60% capacity. Something about a software integration problem they couldn't fix before launch. The backup generators haven't been properly tested, and about a third of the lifeboats have deployment issues that were supposedly addressed but haven't been verified. Jesus, Frank, Jack breathed. And you're letting them continue this voyage. I don't make those decisions, Frank protested. I just report the problems. Elizabeth Caldwell is fighting to turn back, but Harmon has most of the officers intimidated. The company's in financial trouble. Jack, this launch has to succeed, or they lose everything. Jack grabbed Frank's arm. Find Elizabeth Caldwell. Tell her I need to speak with her privately. Tell her it's about Operation Waterway. Frank's brow furrowed. What's Operation Waterway? She'll know, Jack said grimly. Just tell her. I'll be in the Neptune Lounge. As Frank hurried away, Jack leaned against the corridor wall, the ship's increasing motion a constant reminder of the deteriorating conditions outside. Operation Waterway had been the classified name for the naval protection detail assigned to Harold Caldwell's ships during the Libyan crisis, a mission that had ended in tragedy when intelligence failures led to an attack that killed 17 sailors. If Elizabeth remembered that mission, she would understand the gravity of the situation. And if she didn't, then Jack would find another way to get Lily off this ship before history repeated itself in a different form. Elizabeth found Jack exactly where Frank said he would be, sitting alone in the now empty Neptune Lounge. She closed the door behind her, her expression a mixture of confusion and wary interest. "Mr. Reynolds," she began formally. "Frank Moore said you needed to speak with me about Operation Waterway." Jack stood, meeting her gaze directly. "You remember it?" "Of course I remember. 17 naval personnel died protecting my father's ships because of faulty intelligence about Libyan patrol movements." Her eyes narrowed. "What I don't understand is how you know about it. Those details were classified." "I was there," Jack said simply. "Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, USS Hartwell. I was the officer who recommended changing course based on the intelligence we received. I sent those men into an ambush." Understanding dawned on Elizabeth's face. "You were the young officer my father spoke about later, the one who testified at the inquiry." Jack nodded once, the memory still painful after all these years. "Your father stood by me when the Navy wanted a scapegoat, said the responsibility was shared all the way up the chain of command." "That sounds like him," Elizabeth said softly. "He had an unwavering sense of accountability." She straightened, her professional demeanor returning. "But why bring this up now?" "Because history's about to repeat itself," Jack replied. "This ship isn't ready for the storm we're sailing into. Your CEO knows it. Your engineers know it. And now you know it. We need to turn back to Harbor Point while we still can." "Richard is insisting the ship can handle the weather," Elizabeth said, frustration evident in her voice. "He claims the financial consequences of turning back would be catastrophic. Not as catastrophic as what happens if we start taking on water with compromised evacuation systems," Jack countered. "I've seen the reports, Elizabeth. The lifeboats, the stabilizers, the backup power, none of it is fully operational." "How do you know all this?" "Frank Moore is an old friend. We served together. He tried to warn me yesterday, but I didn't fully believe him until I saw the evidence myself." Elizabeth moved to the window, watching the increasingly choppy seas. "I've been fighting this battle since my father died. The board, the shareholders, they all want growth at any cost. Safety measures cut into profits." She turned back to Jack. "But I can't override the captain without evidence of imminent danger." "The storm is your evidence," Jack insisted. "Any experienced sailor would tell you the same." "It's not enough," Elizabeth sighed. "Richard has the captain convinced we can outrun the worst of it." Jack stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Then give me access to the engineering decks. Let me document the safety violations. Give you something concrete to take to the captain." Elizabeth studied him, weighing the request. "Why are you involved in this? Jack, what's your stake?" "My daughter's on this ship," he replied simply. "And I've already lost too many lives to bad decisions made by people who should know better." After a long moment, Elizabeth nodded. "All right, I'll get you access. But we need to be discreet. If Richard suspects what we're doing, I understand," Jack assured her. "And Elizabeth, thank you." As they made plans to meet in 30 minutes, neither noticed the figure watching through the partially open door, Richard Harmon. his expression darkening with each overheard word. The storm struck with surprising ferocity. What had been forecast as a gradual intensification instead became a rapid deterioration of conditions. Waves that had been 3 to 4 feet swelled to 10 and 12, slapping against the hull of the Oceanic Majesty with increasing violence. Wind howled around the upper decks, forcing most passengers inside. In the Marine Research Lab, Lily and Sarah were examining water samples when the first significant roll made equipment slide across countertops. "That doesn't feel normal," Lily said, steadying herself against a cabinet. Sarah's professional composure slipped for the first time. "It's not." She moved to the wall-mounted phone, dialing quickly. After a brief conversation, she hung up, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" Lily asked. "Nothing to worry about," Sarah replied automatically, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, there's no point pretending. The storm's intensified faster than expected. They're asking all passengers to return to the main lounges." "I should find my dad," Lily said, gathering her belongings. "I'll help you," Sarah offered. "He's probably in the Neptune lounge with the other parents." As they made their way through the corridors, the ship's motion became increasingly pronounced. Announcements began playing over the PA system, assuring passengers that the situation was under control while directing them to designated areas. "The stabilizers should be handling this better," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Lily. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. "The Majesty has advanced stabilization systems that should minimize this kind of rolling, even in heavy seas. If we're feeling it this much..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Something wasn't working as it should. When they reached the Neptune lounge, they found it filled with anxious passengers, but no sign of Jack. One of the scholarship parents recognized Lily. "Your father left about 20 minutes ago," when the woman informed her. "Right after that Atlantis executive came to speak with him." Lily felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Which executive, the older blonde woman, seemed important? "My mother," Sarah said, exchanging a concerned glance with Lily. "Elizabeth Caldwell." Before they could discuss further, the ship lurched violently, sending unsecured objects crashing to the floor. The lights flickered, then stabilized. "That was not good," Sarah said, her professional mask completely gone now. She pulled out a staff access card. "Come on, we need to find them." Jack and Elizabeth had made their way to the engineering deck, using her executive access to bypass security. What they found confirmed Jack's worst fears. The backup generators were offline for maintenance. The stabilization system was operating at minimal capacity, and the engine room was understaffed for emergency conditions. "This is criminal," Elizabeth said as they documented the violations with a pocket camera she'd brought. "Richard assured me all these issues had been addressed." "He lied," Jack said simply, examining a pressure gauge that was showing dangerous readings. "We need to get the captain to turn this ship around immediately." A sudden, violent roll of the ship sent them both staggering against the bulkhead. Warning lights flashed across the engineering control panels. "We're taking heavy seas broadside," Jack observed grimly. "Worst possible position?" Chief Engineer Ramirez burst into the compartment, followed by two assistants. He stopped short at the sight of Elizabeth and Jack. "Ms. Caldwell, you shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "What's our status, Chief?" Elizabeth demanded, ignoring the objection. Ramirez hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only option in the deteriorating situation. "We've lost the port stabilizer completely. Starboard is at 30% capacity. Engine 1 is overheating from compensating for the strain." "We need to reduce speed and change course," Jack interjected. "Get the bow into the waves." "Who is this?" Ramirez asked Elizabeth, eyeing Jack suspiciously. "Someone who knows ships," Elizabeth replied. "And he's right. Call the bridge. Tell them to change course immediately." Before Ramirez could respond, the ship shuddered violently. A deafening bang echoed through the hull, followed by a cascade of warning alarms. Port engine just redlined, one of the assistants shouted over the noise. We're losing pressure in the coolant system. Shut it down, Ramirez ordered, moving quickly to the control station. Switch all systems to starboard engine. The strain will be too much, Jack warned. You need to reduce speed by at least 50%. Ramirez nodded grimly, relaying the instructions to the bridge. As he worked, Elizabeth pulled Jack aside. This is worse than I thought, she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. If we lose propulsion entirely— One problem at a time, Jack replied, projecting a calm he didn't entirely feel. First priority is stabilizing the ship. Then we find our daughters and get everyone to muster stations as a precaution. The overhead lights flickered again, then shifted to the amber glow of emergency lighting. A moment later, Captain Wright's voice came over the all-call system. Attention all passengers and crew. This is the captain speaking. Due to deteriorating weather conditions, we are altering course and reducing speed. All passengers are instructed to proceed to their designated muster stations for a precautionary safety briefing. I repeat, this is precautionary only. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions. At least he's taking it seriously now, Elizabeth said. She turned to Ramirez. Chief, get me a damage assessment as soon as possible. I'll be on the bridge. As they hurried toward the exit, a large figure blocked their path, Richard Harmon, his face twisted in anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? Elizabeth, he demanded. The passengers are panicking, and now you've convinced Wright to turn back. The ship isn't seaworthy, Richard, Elizabeth shot back. We've documented at least a dozen critical safety violations. The responsible action is to return to port immediately. The responsible action is to protect our investment, Richard countered. Do you have any idea what the financial implications will be if this launch fails? The stock will collapse. We'll face lawsuits, insurance investigations. Better than deaths on your conscience, Jack interrupted. Richard turned his glare on Jack. Who the hell are you to interfere in company business? Some washed-up fisherman with a grudge against success? I'm someone who's seen what happens when profit comes before safety, Jack replied evenly. And I'm not letting it happen again, especially not with my daughter on board. Richard's expression shifted, a calculating look replacing the anger. Ah, yes, Lily Reynolds, the scholarship candidate with the unfortunate medical condition. Jack stiffened. What are you talking about? Asthma, isn't it? Richard's voice was casual, but his eyes were cold. Respiratory distress can be so dangerous at sea, especially if medical assistance isn't readily available. Are you threatening my daughter? Jack took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. Elizabeth moved between them. That's enough. Richard, you're overstepping. No, Elizabeth, you're overstepping, Richard replied. The board gave me operational authority for this launch. Not you. Your name might be on the company, but your power is purely symbolic, something you do well to remember. The ship lurched again, more violently than before. Alarms blared from the engineering stations. We just lost the starboard engine, Ramirez shouted, switching to emergency power. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Richard seemed oblivious to the danger, still focused on his confrontation with Elizabeth. I want you both off the engineering decks now, he ordered. Return to your cabins and stay there until this situation is resolved. You're making a mistake, Richard, Elizabeth warned. One that could cost lives. The only mistake was letting sentiment cloud business judgment, Richard replied. Your father understood that sometimes risks are necessary for progress. Don't you dare invoke my father, Elizabeth's voice was ice. Harold Caldwell never gambled with passengers' lives. Before Richard could respond, an explosion rocked the ship, distant but powerful enough to knock them all off balance. Emergency klaxons began wailing throughout the vessel. Fire in the forward engine compartment, someone shouted from the control room. We're losing pressure in fire suppression systems. Richard's face drained of color as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his corporate armor. That's That's not possible. The systems were certified. On paper, Jack said grimly. Not in reality. He turned to Elizabeth. We need to find our daughters. Now! As they ran from the engineering deck, leaving a stunned Richard behind, the Oceanic Majesty listed noticeably to port a massive ship beginning its surrender to the implacable forces of nature and human negligence. The perfect storm, both literal and figurative, had arrived. Chaos erupted throughout the Oceanic Majesty as the combined effects of the storm and mechanical failures transformed the luxury cruise experience into a nightmare. Passengers crowded the corridors, some following crew instructions to muster stations, others panicking and rushing toward perceived safety. Lily and Sarah fought against the tide of bodies, trying to make their way to the engineering decks where they believed their parents might be. The ship's increasing list made progress difficult, and the emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie amber glow. We should go to a muster station, Lily shouted over the noise of alarms and frightened passengers. That's where they'll look for us. You're right, Sarah agreed reluctantly. But which one? They're all going to be overcrowded. A crew member appeared through the chaos, recognizable by his uniform despite the panicked expression he wore. Sarah grabbed his arm. Status report, Riti, she demanded, summoning the authority she'd inherited from her mother. The young man's eyes widened in recognition. Ms. Caldwell Engineering says we've lost both main engines and have a fire in the forward compartment. Captain's ordered evacuation preparations. Which muster stations are operational? Sarah asked. A through D on the starboard side, he replied. Port side stations are becoming inaccessible due to the list. We'll head to Station B, Sarah decided. It's closest to the bridge. Our parents will likely go there. As they changed direction, Lily felt the familiar tightening in her chest that signaled an asthma attack approaching. The stress, the physical exertion, the fear, all triggers her doctor had warned about. She reached into her pocket for her inhaler, only to find it missing, likely fallen out during their rush through the ship. Sarah, she gasped, the wheeze becoming audible. My inhaler, I lost it. Sarah looked back, alarm crossing her face as she recognized the symptoms. Hang on. The infirmary is one deck down. We'll get you another one. They fought their way to a service stairwell, avoiding the crowded main corridors. The ship's list made descending treacherous, and twice they had to brace against the walls as particularly violent waves struck the vessel. When they finally reached the infirmary, they found it abandoned. Medical supplies scattered across the floor from the ship's violent motion. Sarah moved quickly, searching through cabinets. Here, she exclaimed, holding up an emergency asthma inhaler. Standard equipment on all our ships. Lily took it gratefully, administering the medication with practiced movements. Almost immediately, her breathing began to ease. Thank you, she managed after a moment. I don't usually. It's just the stress. Don't apologize, Sarah said firmly. Now let's get to muster station B. As they prepared to leave the infirmary, the overhead sprinklers suddenly activated, drenching them in cold water. A moment later, the ship's public address system crackled to life. Attention all passengers and crew. This is Captain Wright. We have a confirmed fire situation in the forward sections. All persons must proceed immediately to their designated muster stations for evacuation. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Sarah and Lily exchanged terrified glances. What had been a precautionary measure minutes ago was now a full evacuation order. We need to hurry, Sarah urged, leading the way back to the stairwell. When they emerged one deck up, they found the corridor partially flooded seawater sloshing across the carpeted floor with each roll of the ship. That's not rainwater, Lily observed, her scientific mind automatically analyzing despite the danger. We're taking on water from somewhere. The fire might have compromised a bulkhead, Sarah suggested grimly. Come on, muster station B is this way. They waded through the ankle-deep water, fighting against the ship's increasing tilt. The emergency lighting flickered ominously, threatening to plunge them into darkness. Sarah, a voice called from ahead. Lily. Two figures emerged from an intersecting corridor, Jack and Elizabeth, both soaked and disheveled, but mercifully alive. Dad! Lily rushed forward, embracing her father with desperate relief. Are you hurt? Jack asked, checking her over with anxious eyes. I'm okay, Lily assured him. Just had a little asthma trouble, but Sarah helped me. Elizabeth hugged her daughter tightly. Thank God you're both all right. We've been searching everywhere. What's happening? Sarah asked. Is it as bad as it seems? Worse, Elizabeth replied honestly. The ship is taking on water faster than the pumps can handle. The fire has cut off access to the forward sections, including several muster stations. We need to get to the lifeboats, Jack added. But there's a problem. Many of them are on the port side, which is already too steeply angled for safe deployment. How many people can we evacuate? Sarah asked. Professional even in crisis. If all the starboard lifeboats work properly, maybe 2,000, Elizabeth estimated. But there are over 3,000 people on board. The implications hung in the air between them. Even in the best-case scenario, not everyone would make it off the ship. The Coast Guard, Lily suggested hopefully. They've been notified, Jack confirmed. But in this storm, they're at least 90 minutes out. We need to buy time. A tremendous groaning sound reverberated through the hull metal under stress, pushed beyond its design limits. The ship lurched again, the list becoming more pronounced. We don't have much time, Jack said grimly. We need to reach Muster Station C. It has access to the largest capacity lifeboats. As they made their way through the increasingly treacherous corridors, they encountered pockets of trapped passengers, elderly couples unable to navigate the tilting floors, families with young children frozen in fear, individuals injured during the chaotic rush to evacuate. Jack and Elizabeth naturally fell into leadership roles, directing people towards safety, delegating tasks to those able to help others. Their daughters followed their example, Lily using her inhaler to help an elderly woman with respiratory distress, Sarah translating instructions for a family who spoke only Spanish. When they finally reached Muster Station C, they found it in disarray. The crew member in charge was overwhelmed, unable to maintain order among the terrified passengers fighting to board the lifeboats. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. Listen to me. We will evacuate in an orderly fashion. Women, children, and injured first. Anyone who pushes will go last. Her authoritative tone had an immediate effect. The crowd quieted, organization emerging from panic. Jack moved to inspect the lifeboat deployment systems, his experienced eye quickly identifying potential problems. The automatic release is malfunctioning, he informed Elizabeth quietly. We'll need to use the manual override. Can you operate it? She asked. Jack nodded. Naval training, but it's slower. We'll only be able to launch one boat at a time instead of pairs. Then we'd better start now. Working together, they began the evacuation process. Each lifeboat could hold 150 people, but loading took precious minutes they weren't sure they had. The ship's list was increasing steadily, and smoke from the fire was beginning to reach their section. After the third lifeboat was away, a familiar figure stumbled into the muster station, Frank Moore, his face streaked with soot, supporting an injured crew member. Jack, he called, relief evident in his voice. Engineering deck is completely flooded. Fire's spreading faster than we can contain it. How much time do we have? Jack asked, helping Frank lower the injured man onto a bench. The bulkheads are holding for now, but Frank shook his head grimly. 30 minutes, maybe less, before we start losing structural integrity. Elizabeth, who had been coordinating the loading of the next lifeboat, joined them. We've evacuated about 600 people. There are still over 2,000 on board. Who in the other muster stations? Jack asked. Communications are down, Frank replied, but last report said stations A and B were launching successfully. D and E are compromised by the fire. A sudden impact shuddered through the ship, powerful enough to knock several people off their feet. Alarms that had momentarily quieted began wailing with renewed urgency. "What was that?" Lily asked, steadying herself against a wall. "Felt like we hit something," Jack said, moving quickly to the nearest window. Outside, barely visible through the storm-lashed darkness, a massive shipping container floated past cargo lost from some other vessel battling the same storm. The impact had torn a gash in the Oceanic Majesty's hull, just above the waterline but perilously close. "We need to speed this up," Jack announced, returning to the group. "The hull's been breached on the starboard side. When that breach goes underwater due to the list," he didn't need to finish. They all understood the implications. As they redoubled their evacuation efforts, Richard Harmon appeared at the muster station, flanked by two security officers. Unlike earlier, his corporate polish had completely vanished. His expensive suit was torn and soaked, his carefully styled hair plastered to his head. "Elizabeth," he called, approaching their group. "The captain's dead. Heart attack during the evacuation. The first officer is trapped on the bridge." Elizabeth's face paled. "Who's in command?" "Technically you, as the senior company executive. Practically," Richard gestured helplessly around them. "It's every person for themselves at this point." For once, there was no arrogance in his tone, only the shocked recognition of a disaster beyond his control. "We need to get these people off the ship," Elizabeth said firmly. "All other considerations are secondary." Richard nodded, a shadow of his former combative self. "I've instructed security to assist with evacuation. What do you need me to do?" Elizabeth seemed momentarily taken aback by his cooperation, but quickly recovered. "Help Frank coordinate loading. We need to fit as many people as safely possible into each boat." As Richard moved to comply, Jack pulled Elizabeth aside. "He's right about one thing: we're running out of time. We need to consider alternative evacuation methods, such as the ship's tenders on the lower deck. They're not ideal in these conditions, but they're large enough to hold 50 people each." "Can they be launched with the ship listing like this?" "It'll be difficult," Jack admitted, "but I've done harder things." Elizabeth studied his face, seeing the determination there. "All right, take Sarah with you. She knows where they're stored and has access codes for the secure areas. I'll continue operations here with Frank and Richard." Jack nodded, then turned to Lily. "I need you to stay with Elizabeth. Help with the evacuation here." "No way," Lily protested. "I'm coming with you." "Lily." "Dad, I can help. I'm not a child anymore." Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The determination in her eyes reminded him so much of Diana that it physically hurt. But there was something else there too, a strength that was entirely Lily's own. "All right," he conceded, "but you stay right with me. No heroics." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth caught Jack's arm. "Be careful. Those tenders aren't designed for storm conditions." "Neither am I," Jack replied with a grim smile. "But here we are." Their eyes held for a moment, an unspoken connection forming in the crucible of crisis. Then Jack, Lily, and Sarah were gone, pushing their way through the chaos toward the lower decks and their desperate mission. Elizabeth turned back to the evacuation operation, a silent prayer for their safety joining the countless others being offered throughout the dying ship. The route to the tender deck took them through increasingly hazardous sections of the ship. Twice they had to find alternate paths due to flooded corridors. The smoke was thickening, making visibility poor and breathing difficult. Lily used her inhaler sparingly, knowing it needed to last. "We're almost there," Sarah assured them as they descended yet another stairwell. "The tender bay is just beyond the next compartment." When they reached the designated door, however, they found it jammed, warped by the ship's structural stress. Jack and Sarah pushed against it with no success. "Stand back," Jack ordered, examining the hinges. "There's another way." He disappeared briefly, returning with a fire axe he'd removed from an emergency station. With practiced swings, he attacked the hinges, the metal giving way under the focused force. "Dad was in the Navy," Lily explained to Sarah, who watched with wide eyes. "He doesn't talk about it much, but he knows ships inside and out." My father was the same way, Sarah replied softly. Always happiest on the water, even in a storm. The door finally yielded, crashing inward to reveal the tender bay, a large area housing 4 smaller vessels designed for shuttling passengers to shore when the main ship couldn't dock. Each tender was essentially a large, enclosed motorboat with seating for 50. They're still secure, Jack observed with relief, moving quickly to the nearest one. The launching mechanism is hydraulic, which means it should still work even with limited power. As they prepared the first tender for launch, a group of passengers and crew appeared at the doorway, about 20 people who had been directed their way by one of Frank's engineering team. Is there room? Asked a woman clutching a terrified child. Yes, Jack confirmed. We can take all of you, plus more. Sarah, start getting them aboard. Lily, help me with the launch sequence. Working quickly, they prepared the tender while Sarah organized the boarding process. More people arrived in small groups, directed by crew members who had spread word of this alternative evacuation route. That's capacity, Sarah announced when the tender was full. 52 people. Stand clear of the launching area, Jack instructed, positioning himself at the control panel. Once the bay doors open, the seas will be rough. Everyone needs to be secured in their seats. With Sarah's access code, Jack activated the launching sequence. Warning lights flashed as the external doors began to open, revealing the storm-tossed ocean beyond. The wind howled through the opening, carrying spray that soaked everyone in the bay. Ready for launch, Jack called after verifying all systems. Brace for motion. He pressed the final button, and the tender began its descent on cables, swaying violently in the wind. Everyone held their breath until confirmation came through the radio. The tender had successfully reached the water, and its pilot had taken control. Moving away from the stricken cruise ship. One down, Jack said, turning to the next tender. 3 to go. They repeated the process with the second tender, filling it quickly with the growing crowd of evacuees. But as they prepared to launch, a tremendous shudder ran through the ship, more violent than anything before. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by emergency chemical lights. That was structural, Jack said grimly when the backup lighting partially activated. We're running out of time. The second tender launched successfully despite the deteriorating conditions. By now, word had spread throughout the ship, and more people were arriving at the tender bay than they could possibly evacuate with the remaining 2 vessels. We can take about 100 more, Jack told the desperate crowd. Priority to children, their guardians, and injured. The decision was agonizing but necessary. Sarah helped organize the boarding, her natural authority keeping panic at bay as people were selected for the third tender. Just as they were preparing to launch, Richard Harmon appeared with a group of senior crew members and what appeared to be VIP passengers. These people need immediate evacuation, he announced, attempting to bypass the queue Sarah had established. Everyone waits their turn, Jack replied firmly. Children and injured first. Richard's face darkened. Do you know who these people are? The governor. 2 senators. I don't care if they're the president and the pope, Jack interrupted. The protocol doesn't change. For a moment, it seemed Richard might physically challenge the decision. Then, surprisingly, he stepped back. You're right. I apologize. He turned to his group. Ladies and gentlemen, please wait your turn. Those with children, please step forward. The third tender launched successfully, leaving only 1 vessel for the remaining crowd, far more people than it could possibly hold. We need to make a decision, Sarah said quietly to Jack and Lily. There are at least 200 people here, and the tender holds 50. We take the children, then draw lots for the remaining spots, Jack decided. It's the only fair way. What about you 3? Richard asked, having overhead. You've been managing the evacuation. By maritime law, you're entitled to spots. Jack shook his head. We stay until everyone who can be evacuated is evacuated. Dad, no, Lily protested. That's not negotiable. Jack cut her off gently. We started this. We'll finish it. As they began the grim process of selection for the final tender, Elizabeth arrived with Frank and a group of stragglers from the upper decks. "The forward section is completely underwater," she reported, her voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Most of the lifeboats are away, but we still have at least 300 people unaccounted for." Jack quickly explained their situation, one tender remaining. Far too many people to evacuate. "The Coast Guard?" he asked hopefully. Elizabeth shook her head. "Still 30 minutes out, minimum. And in these conditions, helicopter rescue will be nearly impossible." The ship groaned again, the sound of metal giving way, echoing through the structure. The list had increased to the point where standing required constant adjustment for balance. "We need to launch now," Jack decided. "Whatever happens after will have to be handled differently." The final selection was heartbreaking. Children separated from parents. Elderly couples split up. Impossible choices made in impossible circumstances. When the tender was at capacity, Jack prepared the launch sequence, his face a mask of controlled anguish. "What about the rest of us?" someone asked from the crowd remaining in the bay. Jack exchanged glances with Elizabeth, both understanding their options were dwindling rapidly. "Life jackets for everyone," Elizabeth ordered. "Flotation devices. Anything that will keep people above water. If when the ship goes down, we need to stay together in the water until rescue arrives." "That's suicide in these temperatures," Richard objected. "The survival time in 50-degree water is minutes, not hours." "It's better than going down with the ship," Jack countered. "And the Coast Guard will be looking for survivors." As the final tender launched, they began distributing life jackets and organizing the remaining passengers into groups, each led by a crew member who would be responsible for keeping them together in the water. "There's one more option," Frank said, approaching Jack and Elizabeth. "The crew escape boat in the stern section. It's small, designed for 20 people in an emergency, but it's better than nothing." "Can we reach it?" Jack asked. "Last I heard, the midship corridors were flooded." "There's a maintenance shaft that runs along the starboard side," Frank explained. "It's tight, but it should still be above the waterline." Elizabeth made an immediate decision. "Take as many as you can fit, children first, then women." "What about you?" Frank asked. "I'll stay with the remaining passengers," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "As will Jack. I assume." Jack nodded, their understanding requiring no words. Frank quickly gathered a group of 20, mostly children, and their mothers, including several from Richard's VIP contingent. As they prepared to leave, Richard approached Jack and Elizabeth. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about everything. The safety protocols, the launch decision, all of it. I was blinded by financial concerns when lives were at stake." "Save it for the inquiry," Jack replied, not unkindly. "If we survive to have one." Richard nodded, then asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "Why are you both staying? You have daughters to think about." "Sarah and Lily went with Frank," Elizabeth explained. "We insisted." It wasn't entirely true their daughters had protested vehemently, but in the end, parental authority had prevailed. Both Jack and Elizabeth had separately come to the same conclusion: their children deserved a chance at survival, even if they themselves didn't make it. "You're good parents," Richard said softly. "Better than I ever was." Before either could respond, the ship lurched violently. The tender bay's external doors, which had been closed after the final launch, buckled inward as a massive wave struck the vessel. Seawater poured through the breach, quickly flooding the compartment. "Everyone out!" Jack shouted, grabbing Elizabeth's arm. "Move to higher decks." The remaining passengers and crew fled toward the exit, fighting against the inrushing water and the ship's increasing tilt. Jack, Elizabeth, and Richard were among the last to leave, ensuring no one was left behind. As they reached the corridor outside, emergency bulkheads began closing automatically, the ship's final defense against catastrophic flooding. The three of them barely made it through before the tender bay was sealed off. "Where to now?" Richard asked, water already swirling around their ankles in the corridor. Up, Jack replied grimly. As high as we can go, and pray the Coast Guard gets here soon. Together they began their ascent through the dying vessel, leading the remaining survivors toward what little hope remained. The Oceanic Majesty, once the pride of Atlantis Cruise Corporation, was entering its final hour, and whether anyone would survive to tell its story remained very much in doubt. The world had shrunk to the confines of their small life raft, bobbing like a cork on waves that seemed to reach for the roiling sky. Jack Reynolds checked his waterproof watch by the feeble glow of the emergency beacon, 3:27 a.m. Nearly 2 hours since the Oceanic Majesty had made its final plunge into the Atlantic. Status check, he called, his voice carrying to the huddled figures around him. Everyone sound off. The roll call had become a ritual every 20 minutes, a way to ensure no one had silently slipped into hypothermia or been washed overboard during particularly violent waves. 23 voices responded, each progressively weaker than they had been at the previous check. Elizabeth Caldwell sat across from him, her blonde hair plastered to her head, her elegant suit replaced by a borrowed crew jacket several sizes too large. She'd been instrumental in their survival, coordinating the final evacuation as the ship listed beyond recovery. When the end came, a catastrophic structural failure that broke the Oceanic Majesty into 2 sections, she and Jack had guided as many survivors as possible to the life rafts that automatically deployed from the upper decks. Coast Guard should have found us by now, Richard Harmon muttered, his earlier contrition giving way to anxious irritation. The emergency beacons are designed to transmit our position. In normal conditions, Jack replied, keeping his voice level. This storm is scrambling everything: radio signals, radar, visibility. They're looking for us, but it's like searching for a needle in a hurricane. Elizabeth reached into her jacket, pulling out a small flask that had somehow survived the chaos. She took a sip, then passed it to an elderly woman shivering beside her. Medicinal purposes only, she explained when Jack raised an eyebrow. Doctor's orders. The woman nodded gratefully, taking a small sip before passing it on. The brandy made its way around the raft, a small comfort against the overwhelming reality of their situation. Do you think the other rafts made it? Elizabeth asked quietly when the flask returned to her. Jack wished he could offer certainty, but the truth was unavoidable. Some of them, the ones that launched before the final breakup, had the best chance. After that, he left the sentence unfinished. They had both seen the chaos as the ship gave its death throes, people thrown into the water, life rafts deploying at impossible angles, the ocean claiming its due. Our daughters made it, Elizabeth said with quiet determination. Frank knows what he's doing. They reached the Coast Guard. Jack nodded, allowing himself to share her conviction. The alternative was unthinkable. Lily's smart, resourceful, and Sarah seemed cut from the same cloth. Stubborn, you mean? Elizabeth's smile was faint but genuine. Gets that from her father. I'm afraid. I'm funny, Jack replied, returning the smile despite everything. I was going to say the same about Lily. Their moment of connection was interrupted by a shout from the far side of the raft. Light, I see a light. Everyone turned, squinting into the darkness. At first, Jack saw nothing but the impenetrable wall of rain and sea spray. Then a flash, rhythmic, unmistakable. That's a searchlight, he confirmed, hope surging through his exhausted body. Everyone, make noise, use the emergency whistles. The raft erupted in a cacophony of whistles, shouts, and improvised noises as they desperately tried to attract attention. Jack fired the last emergency flare, its red glow briefly illuminating their tiny vessel against the vastness of the angry sea. The searchlight swept past them, then returned, fixing on their position. Through the storm, a massive silhouette gradually took shape, the unmistakable profile of a Coast Guard cutter. They found us, Elizabeth breathed, gripping Jack's arm. They actually found us. Told you they were looking, Jack replied, his voice rough with emotion. For the first time since the disaster began, he allowed himself to believe they might survive. As rescue operations commenced a dangerous ballet of heaving seas, skilled seamanship, and sheer determination, Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for other life rafts, other survivors. The night revealed nothing but darkness and water. Elizabeth joined him at the raft's edge as they waited their turn for extraction. "Jack," she said softly, "whatever happens next, the investigations, the recriminations, the lawsuits, I want you to know that without you, none of us would have survived." Jack shook his head. "We all did what needed doing, you included." "Perhaps," Elizabeth conceded, "but you knew from the beginning. You tried to warn us." Before Jack could respond, a Coast Guard rescuer arrived at their raft, secured to the cutter by a safety line that represented their passage back to the world of the living. "Ladies first," Jack insisted as the evacuation began. One by one, and the survivors were transferred to the relative safety of the Coast Guard vessel, until only Jack, Elizabeth, and Richard remained. "Your turn," Jack told Elizabeth. She hesitated. "What about you?" "Right behind you," he promised. "Someone needs to be last." Elizabeth studied his face, then nodded, understanding the unspoken code that had guided his actions throughout the disaster. She accepted the rescuer's assistance, disappearing into the storm toward the waiting ship. "You should go next," Jack told Richard, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during the rescue. Richard shook his head. "I've spent my career pushing others aside to be first. Let me be last this once." Jack assessed the man diminished from the arrogant executive who had dismissed safety concerns hours earlier, but perhaps finding something of his humanity in the face of catastrophe. "Together, then," Jack decided, as the rescuer returned, "we'll be the last two." As they were being pulled toward the cutter, a massive wave struck without warning, lifting the empty life raft and hurling it against them. Jack felt the impact against his side, a flash of pain that was immediately numbed by the cold water. The rescuer's grip on his harness tightened, preventing him from being swept away. But Richard wasn't so fortunate. The wave tore him from the safety line, carrying him into the darkness. "Man overboard," Jack shouted, scanning the churning water. "Port side." The Coast Guard crew responded immediately, directing searchlights toward the area where Richard had disappeared. For agonizing minutes, they searched without success. Then Jack spotted him, a glimpse of pale face amid the waves, already drifting beyond reach. Without hesitation, Jack unclipped his safety harness. "Sir, don't!" the rescuer began. But Jack was already diving into the frigid Atlantic. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Training and instinct took over as he oriented himself, spotting Richard struggling weakly against the current. Using powerful strokes, Jack fought his way through the waves, reaching the drowning man just as he began to sink beneath the surface. "I've got you," Jack gasped, securing an arm around Richard's chest. "Don't fight me." Richard was beyond responding, consciousness fading as hypothermia and exhaustion claimed him. Jack turned toward the cutter, now impossibly distant through the storm. A spotlight found them, and he glimpsed a rescue swimmer entering the water, holding Richard's head above water. Jack fought to remain visible until help arrived. His strength was fading rapidly, the cold penetrating to his bones, when the rescue swimmer finally reached them. "Nice night for a swim," the Coast Guard officer quipped as he secured Richard to a rescue harness. "Thought I'd take a dip," Jack managed through chattering teeth. "Water's fine. Save your strength," the swimmer advised, signaling for the harness to be retracted. "I'll be right back for you." Jack watched as Richard was pulled toward safety, disappearing into the night. The waves seemed determined to separate him from the rescuer, pushing him further from the cutter with each passing moment. His limbs were growing numb, responses sluggish. He knew the signs of severe hypothermia, had been trained to recognize them during his naval service. "Hang on." The rescue swimmer was returning, fighting through the current to reach him. Jack tried to respond, but his body refused to cooperate. The cold had penetrated too deeply, stealing his strength and clarity. As darkness encroached on his vision, he thought of Lily, her determination. her brilliance, her future. At least she was safe. At least he had done that much right. His last conscious sensation was of strong arms encircling him, pulling him from the abyss that had claimed so many others that night. Then darkness claimed him completely. The persistent beeping of medical equipment pulled Jack reluctantly back to consciousness. He opened his eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling, institutional white tiles and fluorescent lighting that marked it as a hospital. The memories returned in a rush, the storm, the sinking ship, the desperate rescue. "Dad!" Lily's voice, thick with emotion, came from beside him. "Can you hear me?" Jack turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, to find his daughter sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her face pale with exhaustion, but she was blessedly, wonderfully alive. "Hey, kiddo," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You okay?" Lily gave a sound between a laugh and a sob. "Am I okay? You're the one who nearly died of hypothermia after playing hero again." Jack tried to sit up, only to discover his body was uncooperative and wrapped in thermal blankets. The others from the life raft. "All safe," Lily assured him. "They brought everyone to Maine Medical Center. We're in Portland. Richard Harmon," Lily's expression sobered. "In intensive care. They're not sure if he'll make it. The doctors said another minute in that water and you'd both be gone." Jack nodded, processing this information. "And Elizabeth, Sarah?" "They're here," Lily said, gesturing toward the door. "They've barely left the waiting room. The nurses would only let one visitor in at a time." Before Jack could respond, a doctor entered, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and tired eyes that had seen too many emergencies in too short a time. "Mr. Reynolds," she greeted him, checking the monitors beside his bed. "Good to see you rejoining us. I'm Dr. Patel. You're a very lucky man." "Doesn't feel lucky," Jack replied, attempting to move his still unresponsive limbs. "The stiffness is normal after severe hypothermia." Dr. Patel explained. "Your core temperature was dangerously low when they brought you in. We had to warm you gradually to avoid shock to your system." "When can I leave, Doctor?" Patel gave him a stern look. "Not for at least 48 hours. You've suffered significant trauma, exposure, and exhaustion. Your body needs time to recover." "Dad," Lily interjected, "please just listen to the doctor for once." Jack recognized the fear behind his daughter's admonishment. "All right, 2 days." After Dr. Patel completed her examination and left, Lily moved closer to the bed. "They're calling you a hero on the news. You and Elizabeth both. They're saying you saved dozens of lives." "We did what needed doing," Jack said, uncomfortable with the label. "Nothing heroic about it." "That's not how the survivors tell it," Lily insisted. "Everyone's talking about how you organized the evacuation, how you kept going back for more people even when the ship was sinking." Jack closed his eyes briefly, unwilling to relive those moments just yet. "What about you? How did you get off the ship?" Lily launched into the story of their escape, how Frank had led them through maintenance corridors to the crew escape boat, their terrifying journey through massive waves, and their eventual rescue by a Coast Guard helicopter that spotted their emergency beacon. "Sarah was amazing," Lily added. "When one of the crew panicked, she took over steering the boat, said she'd learned from watching her grandfather." "She's her mother's daughter," Jack murmured. "Speaking of which, think you could ask Elizabeth and Sarah to come in, just for a minute?" Lily nodded, squeezing his hand before leaving the room. A few moments later, Elizabeth and Sarah entered, both showing signs of the ordeal in their exhausted faces and borrowed clothes, but mercifully intact. "Jack," Elizabeth said, approaching the bed, "thank God you're all right. We've been so worried." "I hear you've been keeping the medical staff in line," Jack replied, managing a weak smile. "Someone had to," Elizabeth said with a hint of her executive authority. "They wanted to separate survivors into different hospitals. I convinced them that would be..." Inadvisable. She threatened to call the governor, Sarah explained with a small smile, who, it turns out, owes his life to our evacuation efforts. Jack's expression grew serious. Any word on the final count? How many? Elizabeth's face tightened. They're still searching, but current numbers are 1,726 survivors out of approximately 3,100 on board. Some lifeboats reached shore independently. Others were picked up by commercial vessels responding to the distress call. The number hung in the air between them, over 300 people lost, a catastrophic toll that placed the Oceanic Majesty disaster among the worst maritime accidents in modern history. It could have been worse, Elizabeth added softly. Without your help, without the tender evacuations and the life raft deployments, it would have been much worse. Jack nodded, unable to find words adequate to the scale of the tragedy. After a moment, he asked, "What happens now? Officially investigations? Multiple agencies? Congressional hearings? Lawsuits?" Elizabeth replied, "The company is already in damage control mode. The board has placed me on administrative leave pending review." "That's ridiculous," Jack protested. "You saved lives." "I also failed to prevent the launch despite safety concerns," Elizabeth pointed out. "In their eyes, I'm either complicit or incompetent. Neither plays well in press releases." "And unofficially," Jack asked. Elizabeth's expression softened. "Unofficially, I find myself reevaluating everything. Priorities, purpose, what matters and what doesn't." Their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The disaster had stripped away pretenses, revealing essential truths about character and values that couldn't be unlearned. "We should let you rest," Elizabeth said after a moment. "But I wanted to thank you, not just for the lives you saved on the ship, but for what you did for Richard. Whatever his faults, that was extraordinary." Jack shook his head slightly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Elizabeth contradicted gently. "They wouldn't have. That's what makes it matter." After they left, Jack fell into an exhausted sleep, his dreams filled with churning water and desperate faces. But somewhere amid the nightmares, there was also the memory of connection, of people rising to impossible circumstances, of courage in crisis, of Elizabeth's steady presence beside him as they fought to save who they could. The congressional hearing room hummed with tension and anticipation. 6 months had passed since the Oceanic Majesty disaster, but public interest remained intense. News cameras captured every moment as the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation prepared to hear testimony on maritime safety regulations and corporate compliance. Jack adjusted his tie uncomfortably, feeling out of place in the formal Washington setting. Beside him, Lily squeezed his hand reassuringly. They were seated in the second row of the public gallery, directly behind the witness table where Elizabeth Caldwell would soon testify. "You sure you're ready for this?" Lily asked quietly. "We could still leave." Jack shook his head. "Elizabeth asked us to be here, said it would help to see friendly faces." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of recovery, investigation, and adaptation. Jack's injuries had healed, but the redemption remained in dry dock, awaiting repairs he couldn't afford. He'd taken temporary work at the Harbor Point Marina, maintaining other people's boats while trying to rebuild their lives. Lily had received a full scholarship to MIT, not from Atlantis Corporation, which was now in bankruptcy proceedings, but from an oceanographic research foundation impressed by her water quality research and her experience during the disaster. She would begin classes in the fall, her future secured despite everything. Their relationship with Elizabeth and Sarah had evolved from crisis-forged connection to genuine friendship. Elizabeth had visited Harbor Point several times during the ongoing investigations, staying at the local inn and spending evenings on Jack's small porch, discussing everything from maritime regulations to favorite books. Sarah and Lily had become inseparable, collaborating on an expanded version of Lily's pollution research that was now being considered for publication in a scientific journal. "There she is," Lily whispered as Elizabeth entered the hearing room. Elizabeth looked different from the corporate executive Jack had first met aboard the Oceanic Majesty. Her tailored suit was more subdued, her bearing less rigidly formal. The disaster had changed her, as it had changed all of them. But the core strength that had guided her through the evacuation remained evident in her straight posture and clear gaze. The committee chairman called the hearing to order, introducing Elizabeth as the former executive vice president of Atlantis Cruise Corporation and a key witness to the events surrounding the disaster. Ms. Caldwell, the chairman began after she was sworn in your written statement, you assert that Atlantis Corporation knowingly compromised safety standards in order to meet financial targets. That's a serious allegation. Can you elaborate? Elizabeth leaned toward the microphone. It is serious, Senator, which is why I've provided the committee with internal documents supporting these claims. For at least 2 years prior to the disaster, Atlantis systematically reduced maintenance schedules, deferred safety equipment upgrades, and understaffed critical positions, all while certifying full compliance with maritime regulations. And you were aware of these practices, another senator asked, his tone suggesting accusation. I became fully aware only in the days immediately preceding the launch, Elizabeth replied evenly. When I attempted to address these issues, I was overruled by the CEO and the board of directors, who controlled majority voting power. Yet you participated in the launch ceremony, the senator pressed. You boarded the vessel knowing these deficiencies existed. Jack tensed at the implied blame, but Elizabeth remained composed. I boarded the vessel to conduct my own inspection and gather evidence of the safety violations, she clarified. My intention was to document these issues and force compliance through regulatory channels. I failed to appreciate how quickly the situation would deteriorate once we encountered the storm. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from specific technical failures to corporate governance issues. Elizabeth answered each query directly, neither deflecting responsibility nor accepting blame that wasn't hers to bear. When asked about the evacuation efforts, she directed credit to others, the crew members who stayed at their posts, the passengers who helped their fellow travelers, and particularly the civilian fishing captain whose maritime experience and extraordinary courage saved dozens of lives. Jack shifted uncomfortably at the reference, though Elizabeth had carefully avoided naming him directly. Their shared ordeal had brought enough media attention already. Neither wanted more. As the hearing recessed for lunch, Elizabeth made her way to where Jack and Lily waited. Despite the grueling questioning, she managed a genuine smile. Thank you for coming, she said, embracing Lily briefly before turning to Jack. It helps. Knowing there are people here who understand what really happened. You're doing great, Jack assured her. Those senators have no idea what it was like out there. Some of them don't want to know, Elizabeth replied quietly. The cruise industry lobby is powerful. They'd prefer to frame this as an act of God rather than corporate negligence. What happens next? Lily asked as they made their way out of the hearing room, navigating around reporters, shouting questions. More testimony this afternoon, Elizabeth sighed. Then the committee drafts recommendations for regulatory changes. Whether those recommendations become law, she shrugged. Politics. They found a quiet corner in the building's cafeteria, away from curious onlookers and persistent journalists. As they ate sandwiches that none of them really wanted, Elizabeth brought up the subject they'd been avoiding. Richard died this morning, she said softly. His family asked me to tell you. Jack nodded, absorbing the news. Richard Harmon had never fully recovered from his injuries and exposure during the disaster. The last 6 months had been a series of improvements and setbacks, his body ultimately unable to overcome the trauma. He changed his will before the end, Elizabeth continued, left the majority of his personal fortune to a foundation for the families of those lost in the disaster. The rest goes to establish a maritime safety institute. That's, unexpected, Jack admitted. People can surprise you, Elizabeth said, a hint of wonder in her voice. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what matters. The sentiment hung between them, resonating with their shared experience. The disaster had stripped away pretenses, revealing essential truths that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. "How's the boat coming?" Elizabeth asked, changing the subject to something less weighted. Jack grimaced. "Slowly. Insurance covered some of the repairs, but not all. Should be seaworthy by fall, though finding work will be another challenge. The fishing industry isn't exactly booming." "Have you considered other options?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "Your maritime experience is valuable in many fields." "Been too busy getting by to think much about career changes," Jack admitted. "But I'm open to suggestions." Before Elizabeth could respond, her phone rang her attorney, calling about the afternoon session. As she stepped away to take the call, Lily gave her father a meaningful look. "What?" Jack asked, recognizing his daughter's expression. "You know she's going to offer you a job," Lily said. "She's been working up to it for months." Jack frowned. "What are you talking about, Dad? Seriously, the woman has visited Harbor Point 5 times in 6 months. She calls weekly. She values your opinion on everything from boat maintenance to breakfast cereal. We went through something intense together," Jack defended. "That creates a bond." Lily rolled her eyes with teenage exasperation. "A bond. Yes, but this is more than that. And you know it. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Jack could formulate a response, Elizabeth returned, her expression troubled. "They've added a surprise witness for the afternoon session. Frank Moore." Jack straightened. "Frank, I thought he was avoiding the hearings." "Apparently the committee subpoenaed him," Elizabeth explained. "My attorney thinks the industry lobby may have gotten to him trying to shift blame toward individual crew members rather than corporate policy." "Frank wouldn't do that," Jack said firmly. "He was trying to report those safety issues before the launch. He knows where the responsibility lies." "I hope you're right," Elizabeth replied, checking her watch. "We should head back. They're starting in 20 minutes. As they returned to the hearing room, Jack couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Frank had been conspicuously absent from the public investigations, citing health issues from his own ordeal during the sinking. If he'd suddenly decided to testify, they took their previous seats, watching as the committee members returned and called the session to order. Frank Moore was the first witness called, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed slightly too large for his frame. After the swearing-in, the chairman began the questioning. "Mr. Moore, you were employed as a safety consultant for Atlantis Cruise Corporation at the time of the Oceanic Majesty disaster. Is that correct?" "Yes, Senator," Frank confirmed, his voice steady despite his evident discomfort. "And you conducted safety inspections of the vessel prior to its maiden voyage?" "I did." "Please tell the committee what you found during those inspections." Frank glanced briefly toward where Jack and Elizabeth sat before answering. "I identified numerous safety violations that, in my professional opinion, rendered the vessel unsuitable for passenger service." The chairman leaned forward. "And what happened when you reported these violations?" "Initially, I was removed from the project," Frank stated. "Later, I was offered financial compensation to amend my reports to indicate that the issues had been addressed when, in fact, they had not been." A murmur ran through the hearing room. This was more direct than any previous testimony about the alleged bribery. "Did you accept this compensation, Mr. Moore?" The chairman pressed. Frank's jaw tightened. "I did not. I did, however, report the attempted bribe to Ms. Elizabeth Caldwell, who was attempting to address the safety concerns through proper channels." Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Frank hadn't betrayed them after all. "Mr. Moore," another senator interjected, "internal Atlantis records show your signature on the final safety certification for the Oceanic Majesty. How do you explain this discrepancy?" "That signature was forged," Frank replied without hesitation. "I never certified that vessel as seaworthy. In fact, I have here the original reports I filed, with my authentic signature, detailing all the safety violations." He placed a folder on the witness table. "I've maintained these documents despite pressure to destroy them. The committee chairman accepted the folder, examining its contents with evident interest. These appear to be quite detailed. Mr. Moore, why are you only presenting them now? Frank straightened in his chair. Because until now, Senator, I was afraid. The company's legal team made it clear that speaking out would result in personal and professional destruction. But after watching Miss Joran Caldwell's testimony this morning, I realized that fear couldn't justify silence, not when so many lives were lost. The questioning continued, with Frank providing specific details about each safety violation he had documented, from improperly maintained lifeboats to insufficient crew training for emergency situations. His testimony corroborated Elizabeth's accounts while adding technical specificity that only an inspector could provide. By the time Frank was excused, the mood in the hearing room had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as an attempt to distribute blame more widely had instead reinforced the case against Atlantis Corporation's leadership. The final witness of the day was a surprise to everyone, including Elizabeth. Richard Harmon's personal attorney approached the witness table, carrying a sealed envelope. Mr. Chambers, the chairman acknowledged, I understand you have a statement from the late Richard Harmon, former CEO of Atlantis Corporation. I do, Senator, the attorney confirmed. Mr. Harmon recorded this video statement last week with the explicit instruction that it be presented to this committee in the event of his death. A screen descended from the ceiling, and the committee chambers darkened slightly as a projector activated. Richard Harmon's face appeared gaunt from illness, but clear-eyed and composed. My name is Richard Harmon, he began, his voice weaker than Jack remembered, but determined. By the time you view this, I will have died a fate far gentler than what befell over 1,300 souls aboard the Oceanic Majesty. He paused, collecting himself before continuing. I wish to state unequivocally for the record that the disaster was preventable. As CEO, I knowingly authorized the launch despite documented safety concerns because I prioritized financial considerations over human lives. The hearing room was absolutely silent as Richard continued, methodically detailing his role in suppressing safety reports, pressuring inspectors, and misleading regulators. He named board members who had supported these decisions and executives who had implemented them. Elizabeth Caldwell was the sole voice of opposition, Richard stated firmly. She attempted to stop the launch and was systematically undermined by myself and the board. Any attempt to assign her blame for this tragedy is not only factually incorrect but morally reprehensible. As the video concluded, Richard looked directly into the camera. I have no right to ask forgiveness from the families who lost loved ones due to my decisions. I can only offer this truth, in the hope that it prevents similar tragedies in the future. Some costs are too high, regardless of profit margins. I learned this lesson too late. The screen went dark, and the lights returned to normal. The hearing room remained silent for several long moments before the chairman cleared his throat. In light of this testimony, the committee will recess until tomorrow morning, he announced. Miss Caldwell, you are excused from further questioning at this time, though we may recall you if additional information is required. As the hearing adjourned, reporters surged forward, shouting questions at Elizabeth and the committee members. Jack and Lily moved quickly, creating a path for Elizabeth through the chaos toward a side exit where her attorney waited. Did you know about Richard's statement? Jack asked once they were safely in a private conference room. Elizabeth shook her head, visibly shaken. I had no idea. We spoke briefly last week, but he gave no indication. He was making amends, Jack observed quietly. In his own way. It changes everything, Elizabeth's attorney interjected. With Richard's confession and Frank's documentation, the criminal investigations will focus entirely on the board and senior management. Elizabeth, you're essentially cleared. Elizabeth nodded absently, still processing the implications. What about the civil lawsuits? The families? Those will continue and, of course, the attorney acknowledged. But Richard's statement dramatically strengthens the position of the plaintiffs against the corporation rather than individual officers. The insurance companies will likely settle rather than risk trial. As the attorney continued outlining legal strategies, Jack noticed Elizabeth's distant expression. He touched her arm gently. "You okay?" She met his eyes, vulnerability evident in her gaze. "I spent 20 years building that company with my father. Now all that remains is a legacy of loss and lawsuits." "That's not true," Jack countered. "Your father built a company based on principles. You tried to maintain those principles against impossible odds. That legacy isn't destroyed, it's just waiting to be reclaimed." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for reassurance. "You really believe that?" "I do," Jack affirmed. "And I think you do too. Or you wouldn't have fought so hard." Their conversation was interrupted by the attorney's phone, ringing another media request for comment that he stepped away to handle. When they were alone, Elizabeth turned to Jack with sudden determination. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," she began. "A project I've been developing." "Let me guess," Jack said with a small smile. "Something maritime." Elizabeth nodded. "I'm establishing a new venture, Harbor Safety Consultants. Specialized maritime safety inspections, crew training, emergency response protocols, using the lessons from the disaster to prevent future tragedies." "Sounds worthwhile," Jack commented, careful to keep his tone neutral. "It needs experienced leadership," Elizabeth continued. "Someone who understands ships from the deck up, not just from regulatory manuals. Someone who's proven their judgment in crisis situations." "Anyone in mind?" Jack asked, though Lily's earlier words had prepared him for what was coming. "You," Elizabeth said simply. "As operations director, full partnership after 1 year if it's a good fit." Jack considered the offer, turning it over in his mind. It would mean a complete career change, moving from independent fishing to corporate consultation, but it would also mean financial stability, using his maritime knowledge in a meaningful way, and working alongside Elizabeth, a prospect that had become increasingly appealing over the past months. "I'd need to stay in Harbor Point," he said finally. "Lily's leaving for MIT, but I'm not ready to uproot completely." "The Harbor Point harbor master is retiring," Elizabeth replied, clearly having anticipated this concern. "The town needs someone with your qualifications. Between that position and our consulting work, you'd have plenty to keep you busy." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You've thought this through." "I've had 6 months to consider the future," Elizabeth acknowledged, "both professionally and personally." The slight hesitation spoke volumes. This wasn't just a business proposition, and they both knew it. "I'll think about it," Jack promised, though his mind was already leaning toward acceptance. "After the hearings conclude, after we get through this part." Elizabeth nodded, understanding his need to separate the disaster's aftermath from future decisions. "Of course. No pressure." Lily and Sarah returned from getting coffee, their animated conversation about environmental regulations falling silent as they sensed the atmosphere in the room. "Everything okay?" Lily asked, looking between her father and Elizabeth. "Fine," Jack assured her. "Just discussing future possibilities." "About time," Sarah muttered, exchanging a knowing glance with Lily that made Jack wonder just how transparent his growing feelings for Elizabeth had been to their daughters. The attorney returned, ending the moment. "More committee questions tomorrow, but the tone will be different now." Richard's statement changed the dynamic completely. As they prepared to leave for their hotel, Jack found himself walking beside Elizabeth through the marble corridors of the Senate building. Their steps naturally fell into rhythm, comfortable in a shared silence that required no filling. "Whatever you decide about the consultancy," Elizabeth said finally as they reached the exit, "I'm grateful for your friendship these past months. It's meant more than I can adequately express." Jack considered his response carefully. "Some experiences create bonds that don't break easily. What we went through aboard the Majesty, that's not something many people would understand." "No," Elizabeth agreed softly. "It's not." As they stepped into the fading Washington afternoon, Jack made a decision. "There's a small restaurant near our hotel. Nothing fancy, but the food's good. Maybe dinner tonight, just the two of us." Elizabeth's smile was answer enough. I'd like that very much. 1 year later, Harbor Point, Maine. The dedication ceremony for the Harbor Point Maritime Safety Center drew a larger crowd than anticipated. Local residents mingled with officials from the Coast Guard and Maritime Administration, media representatives, and survivors of the Oceanic Majesty disaster who had traveled from across the country to attend. Jack watched from the edge of the newly constructed pier as Elizabeth addressed the gathering, her confidence evident but tempered with the humility that had defined her public appearances since the disaster. The center, funded by the foundation established through Richard Harmon's estate, would serve as both a training facility for emergency response and a research institution dedicated to improving maritime safety standards. Today, we honor not just those lost in the Oceanic Majesty disaster, Elizabeth was saying, but all who have perished at sea due to preventable circumstances. Their legacy lives on in our commitment to ensuring such tragedies are never repeated. Jack felt a surge of pride watching her. The past year had transformed Elizabeth from a corporate executive into a passionate advocate for maritime safety reform. Their consulting firm had quickly established itself as the gold standard for cruise ship inspections, their recommendations carrying weight that reflected their firsthand experience with disaster. His own transformation had been equally profound. From struggling fisherman to Harbor Point's harbor master and operations director of harbor safety consultants, Jack had found purpose in work that utilized his maritime knowledge while allowing him to remain in the community he loved. The Redemption had been fully restored not as a commercial fishing vessel, but as a training boat for emergency response techniques. And now, Elizabeth continued, I'd like to introduce the center's operations director, a man whose courage and leadership during the Oceanic Majesty disaster saved countless lives, Captain Jack Reynolds. Jack stepped forward, still uncomfortable with public recognition but accepting its necessity for their mission. As he took his place beside Elizabeth, their hands briefly touched a small gesture that conveyed volumes to those who knew them well. Thank you, Jack began simply. I'm not one for speeches, so I'll keep this brief. This center represents a promise to learn from tragedy, to honor those lost by protecting those who remain, and to ensure that commercial interests never again supersede human safety on the water. He gestured toward the sleek new building with its state-of-the-art training facilities. Every person who trains here will carry forward the lessons we learned at tremendous cost. Every safety recommendation that originates from our research will protect lives that might otherwise be at risk. This isn't just a building or an institution, it's a legacy of responsibility. The applause was warm and genuine. As Jack concluded his remarks, he spotted Lily and Sarah in the front row, home from MIT for the dedication. Their joint research project on cruise ship environmental impacts had recently been published in a prestigious scientific journal, launching what promised to be distinguished careers for both young women. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed to tour the facilities, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the harbor, looking out at the familiar waters that had defined his life. Elizabeth joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy comfort of a relationship built on shared purpose and deepening affection. Penny for your thoughts, she said, following his gaze across the bay. Just thinking about journeys, Jack replied. How they rarely end up where you expect. Elizabeth nodded, understanding. A year ago, I was testifying before Congress, watching my family's company disintegrate, wondering what possible future remained. And now, she smiled, turning to face him directly. Now I'm exactly where I need to be, doing work that matters, with people who matter even more. The simple sincerity in her voice resonated with Jack's own feelings. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the past year, from crisis-forged connection to professional partnership to something deeper and more personal. Neither had rushed, both carrying scars from past losses that counseled patience. The board approved your harbor expansion proposal, Elizabeth mentioned after a comfortable silence. Construction starts next month. Good, Jack nodded. The additional moorings will help the local fishing fleet, and the improved facilities should attract more recreational boaters. The town could use the economic boost. Always thinking of others, Elizabeth observed. That's what drew me to you. You know, from that first day aboard the Majesty, you never hesitated to put others first. Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Did what needed doing, same as you. Perhaps, Elizabeth conceded, but not everyone recognizes what needs doing, let alone acts on it regardless of personal cost. Before Jack could respond, Sarah approached, camera in hand. Mom, they want photos of you and Jack with the center's advisory board for the press release. Duty calls, Elizabeth sighed, squeezing Jack's hand before releasing it. Dinner tonight, the usual place. Wouldn't miss it, Jack assured her. Their usual place was the Rusty Anchor, the same harborside tavern where Frank Moore had first warned him about the Oceanic Majesty's safety issues. Life's circles often completed themselves in unexpected ways. As Elizabeth walked away with Sarah, Lily joined her father at the harbor's edge. Successful day, she observed. The center's going to make a real difference. That's the plan, Jack agreed. Your research will help too, once the EPA incorporates your recommendations into their new cruise ship emission standards. Lily beamed at the acknowledgement. Sarah and I are already working on a follow-up study focused on waste management systems. The data from the Majesty disaster opened doors that would normally stay closed to undergraduate researchers. Jack studied his daughter with quiet pride. The scared 16-year-old who had boarded the Oceanic Majesty seeking a scholarship had emerged from tragedy with newfound purpose and confidence. Her asthma was better managed now, her academic future secure, her passion for environmental science fueling work that would protect the oceans she loved. Dad, Lily's voice interrupted his reflections. Are you ever going to ask Elizabeth to marry you? Or should I start dropping more obvious hints? Jack nearly choked. What makes you think, please? Lily rolled her eyes with fond exasperation. You've been practically living together for months. You finish each other's sentences. You're happier than I've seen you since Mom died. It's not exactly a state secret. Jack sighed, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small box. Was planning to ask tonight. Actually, after dinner. Lily's eyes widened as she took in the simple but elegant ring. It's perfect. She'll love it. You think so? Jack asked, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. It's not flashy, but it reminded me of her. Straightforward, genuine. It's exactly right, Lily assured him, hugging him impulsively. Mom would approve. You know, she always said life was for living, even after loss. Jack returned the embrace, throat tight with emotion. Diana had indeed said that, during the dark days of her illness when they had discussed the impossible future without her. He'd never expected to find love again, had resigned himself to solitary purpose as Lily's father and provider. But life, like the sea, had its own currents, unpredictable forces that carried you to unexpected shores. You're okay with this? He asked, needing his daughter's blessing despite her obvious approval. It changes things. Dad, Lily said seriously, things already changed when the Majesty sank. Everything after has been figuring out what that means. Elizabeth and Sarah becoming part of our lives, that's one of the few good things to come from that day. As they walked back toward the center for the reception, Jack glanced once more across the harbor. The water was calm today, sunlight dancing across its surface as fishing boats and pleasure craft moved through the channel. Beautiful, serene, yet he knew better than most how quickly conditions could change, how lives could hang in the balance during moments of crisis. The Oceanic Majesty disaster had taught him that terrible truth, but it had also shown him something else, that even in darkness, people could rise to extraordinary heights. That connection could emerge from chaos, that purpose could be forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Tonight, he would ask Elizabeth to build a future with him, not despite their shared trauma, but partly because of it. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and their most determined. They had witnessed each other's courage and compassion. What stronger foundation could any relationship have as they reached the center? Elizabeth caught his eye across the crowded reception, smiling in a way that was meant only for him. Jack returned the smile, his hand closing around the ring box in his pocket. Some journeys ended in disaster. Others led to unexpected beginnings. The trick, Jack reflected, was recognizing the difference and having the courage to set sail again, even after weathering the worst storms life could unleash. The Atlantic keeps no record of the lives it claims. No monument stands upon its restless surface to mark where the oceanic majesty surrendered to the deep, taking 1,300 souls with her. Only coordinates on maritime charts and memories in the hearts of those left behind. Some disasters change nothing. Lessons go unlearned. Sacrifices unremembered as profit once again overtakes prudence. But sometimes tragedy becomes transformation when ordinary people refuse to let the waters close over truth. A harbor master stands at the edge of his pier, watching fishing boats return at dusk. The woman beside him no longer defined by boardrooms and balance sheets, but by courage and conviction. In Boston, two young women in a university lab analyze water samples. Their friendship forged in terror now directed toward protection. And in Washington, safety regulations bear the names of those who never came home. We measure storms not just by their destruction, but by what remains when skies clear. The broken vessels, the salvaged hopes, the connections formed when strangers face mortality together and discover what truly matters beneath the trappings of status and success. Perhaps that's the sea's most profound lesson, that only by weathering life's fiercest tempests do we truly learn what we're made of, and what we're willing to risk for one another when the waters rise.